My name is Andrea Carice, and I am an assistant professor in the departments of English and the Interdisciplinary Center for Health and Society. Welcome. It is wonderful to see you and to see all of you. What a turnout today. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be introducing the second speaker of this month's Great Explorations season, whose theme is disability studies. I've been asked also to remind you to please fill out a feedback form. If you don't fill out a feedback form in the university, it means something didn't exist. So you have to make sure that you do that. Make sure we all know we were here. Okay? Also, if you'd like to see other themes as part of the Great Exploration series, this is your chance to offer us some suggestions. Today's speaker is the Director of Programming at Tangled Art and Disability. And previous to this role, he was Tangled's inaugural curator in residence, as well as Tangled's gallery manager. In addition, Sean is an independent lecturer and holds a BA in Arts Management and Studio from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He currently sits on the board of the 8Fest Creative Users Project and is a member of the Ontario Art Council's Deaf and Disability Advisory Group. Sean Lee's talk today, entitled Crip Horizons, Disability Art Futurism, will discuss how the emergence of the disability arts movement has been pivotal to reframing our understanding of disability through its political activism, agency, and curatorial excellence, which transcends the barriers of language to engender new aesthetic potential. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Sean Lee.
So I want to thank the Dean's Office for this invitation to connect with everyone here through the Great Explorations speaker series. And before I begin, I also just want to acknowledge some of the mentors that have made it possible for me to be in this space today. Sherry Helwig, Tanya Mars, all the amazing profs that I've had here at UTSC. And also I want to acknowledge disability artists and curators who have really paved the path for me. Folks like Eliza Chandler and Lindsay Fisher, two mentors whose culture building efforts have enabled me to take part in this vibrant and really exciting sector in the arts right now. The ideas, what I'm sharing here today is really an expression of collective knowledge. So these ideas have really been born and borrowed from a lot of conversations that I've just had the privilege to be a part of during this formative couple of years during the disability arts movement. So I first want to acknowledge, I also want to acknowledge the land and its traditional keepers. And I recognize that oftentimes these can end up becoming sort of token gestures rather than meaningful practice. But I think it is important that all settlers, including new immigrants and recent arrivants, recognize we have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacies of colonialism. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the land of the indigenous peoples and nations long before colonial documentation of time, specifically the Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, people who continue to work and live here on what is known as Toronto or the north part of Turtle Island. We want to acknowledge this land and the indigenous peoples who have passed, and to recognize that this land we're on, we share with each other and have a responsibility with each other to take care of this land. And one way that I'd like to resist colonial aspects of being in time and space together is to take our time. I hope everyone here today is relatively comfortable. There's food, there's drinks. I invite everyone to make noise, to move or take breaks as they need. There are washrooms down the hall over there, and please feel free to step out, take breaks, and to always to come back. I'll be doing my best to describe any images that I show on the screen, and if anyone's unable to, needs me to speak up or needs me to repeat, please just raise your hands and I can repeat anything that might have been missed. I also did bring a little jar of what's called stim toys, and so I'm going to pass this around. Just if anybody feels that it would help them to participate, or if it would help them just to have one of these toys to fidget around with during this talk, you're more than welcome to take one. And I'm gonna start with Anne over here and just give you one. And yeah, if you don't need one, feel free not to take one. So we can pass it on. So yeah, the space is relaxed, and I do want to make that a point of the essence of what we're doing here, because the content of what we talk about today, it is heavy. I reference the pervasive nature of ableism, racism, cissexism, heterosexism, but I won't say that there's any explicit moments of this in the presentation. So I don't believe there will be anything that's triggering in this presentation. But again, my experiences, what I feel will differ from everyone else's experiences. So I just ask that we all kind of try to help take care of each other in this space where we've all gathered today. So that was a long preamble, and let's get started. So on the screen, there's a Tangled. This is the Tangled logo. It's a little bit of a pink line that's drawn in kind of this geometric abstract shape that's connected together. And on the screen, it says Crip Horizons, Disability Art Futurism. And it says, well, we have to start somewhere. So just the image on screen is Ebony Rose Dark performing at Cripping the Arts in 2019. They're dressed in a spandex suit, clutching their hair in kind of this model pose, and they're wearing a DIY crown on their head, and they're lit in this like really interesting dark red kind of lighting. And behind them is, in this dark blue background, are the letters VIP. So I want to start by this presentation by asking that we expand what we perceive disability to be. Historically, disability rights has been delegated to sort of considering disability only in a silo, and that is one that's been overly focused on sort of the straight, white, male experience of disability, and it's oftentimes been one focused on the visibility, the hyper-visibility of visible disabilities. But like many others who work to drive the rights of disability activism forward, I'm going to be centering something called disability justice as a framework for approaching and dismantling ableism, because I think it's important to consider the complex intersections located within race, gender, and queer politics that can inform different experiences of disability. And I think this is especially vital to consider this framework within the context of Dustin P. Gibson's definition of ableism. So on the screen over here, we have a definition written out of ableism by Dustin P. Gibson, who's a disability advocate in the States. And it says that ableism is an anti-Black system that assigns value based on the ability to produce profit, excel, and behave, and enforces a false idea of normalcy. So we can see from this definition that ableism's core kind of principles are rooted in this idea of how we behave against this mythic norm, a body that is meant in this neoliberal framework of society only to produce profit under a capitalist system. And I think it's important to consider that in disability justice, the core principles of disability are rooted in its recognition that disability is a natural component of identity rather than an impairment. Ableism, in this way, becomes this anti-Black system, and it's assigning values only based on people's bodies and minds in this societally constructed idea of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence. And these ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence are deeply rooted in anti-blackness, eugenics, and capitalism. And it's a form of systemic oppression that leads people in society by determining who is valuable or who is worthy based on the appearance or ability to satisfactorily produce profit, excel, and behave. And I think what's really important here is that you don't necessarily have to be disabled to experience ableism through this definition. Gibson's definition exposes those dimensions of ableism that uphold and strengthen every other system of oppression. And I think I'll get to that later on. But first, I'm going to start with the context of disability representation. So on this slide, we've got a list of the ways historically that disability and disabled folks have been perceived. So it ranges from one, pitiable and pathetic, sweet and innocent, or a miracle cure. We can think of folks like Tiny Tim in the Christmas kind of series. They're oftentimes historically disabled folks have been depicted as victims or objects of violence, sinister or evil. They've been used as atmosphere, so as kind of in the freak show depictions and in comics and horror movies and science fiction. Or they're supercrips, that is, they triumph over tragedy and they're this sort of perfect, noble warrior. They can be laughable or the butt of jokes. They can have a chip on their shoulder or have kind of this aggressive avenger kind of depiction. They're often a burden. They're often non-sexual and not worthy of a relationship. And most kind of commonly, I feel, they're often incapable of fully participating in everyday life. So looking at this list, one might get the sense that ableist logic really dictates the world. And I think this comes from my knowledge that as a visibly disabled person, that every other visibly disabled person I know shares a similar experience to this. Eliza Chandler once said that, dictated by ableist logic, our world is one wherein discrimination against disabled people makes sense. And this sense is that ableism floods our dominant culture and is further secured every time she notices that a building is built without a ramp or an elevator, or every time she has to open a heavy door and struggles to do that. Every time we hear words like crazy or lame lazily appear in our everyday conversation. So in this way, disability is locked by discrimination in a way that's positioned to make sense. That is, it's collectively tolerated and collectively responded to with apathy, if at all. But in order to think about the possibilities and also the limits for how we can embody what I would call CRIP identities and recognizing these CRIP communities, then we first do have to explore how we normatively understand disability and the normative culture and terrain wherein these CRIP communities are enacted. Because bodies marked by disability are said to hold no future. They're often thought of as empty vessels in which ableism insidiously pushes its agenda. And as Alison Kafer notes in her book, Feminist Queer Crip, Alison says, "My wheelchair, burns, scars, and gnarled hands apparently tell the world all they need to know, that my future is written on my body. And this future is one in a sight of no future. That is, folks with disability are often seen as a site within which disability is unlivable, or as seen as the end of a livable life, as you will. But I think that disability has always been here, and it actually will be in our futures. So in this next slide, there's the title, Disability Aesthetic, and there's a quote from a disability scholar, Tobin Siebers, which says that disability aesthetics seeks to emphasize the presence of different bodies and minds in the tradition of aesthetic representation, that tradition concerned most precisely with the appearance of the beautiful. And in this image next to it is one of the Venus de Milo, and the Venus is this, I think, like a porcelain or marble bust of Venus, who's like an angel with arms that only go down to her shoulders. And this is something that scholars have often debated: is would the Venus de Milo be this iconic figure if the Venus de Milo had her arms? And I think this is a very vital moment in which we can consider how the disability aesthetic has been something employed within the arts canon before it's even been recognized as such. But I think it holds this potential for how we can consider disability as something that has been in our lives and has the potential to continue to propel our futures forward. So I said that disability is here and it's in our futures, and I say this in tune with Kelly Fritsch in declaring that disability is not something we have, but something we participate in. That disability arts and culture animate the means by which we can live with disability. And it's through these sensibilities and discourses that disability is not only imbued with possibility, but with transformative meaning, value, and desirability. And the formation of a distinct disability culture through art motions not only to the transformative possibilities of art itself, but points to this potential for art to reinvent what reality itself can be. So nowhere is this idea more understood than, more underscored than in an ableist history that has seemingly employed the aesthetic of disability as an articulated, unique resource, recouped for aesthetic creation and appreciation. And these aesthetic ideals can become central to one's cultural identity and evaluations of beauty that can become linked to things like desirability. And so when we think about the potential of disability and its disruption of standard aesthetics, it's something that we can think of as being part of the historic canon. Artists like Rene Magritte painted the Venus in a full depiction in flesh tones, and actually painted the Venus with these bandaged arms as if to showcase a recent amputation. And what Magritte was doing here was to note this resource of disability and to really link the Venus's depiction as being integral to the figure that it's in today, and not as imagined as this full figure with arms and as an able-bodied person. So Siebers makes this astute observation that disability, in this sense, enlarges our vision of human variation and difference and puts forward perspectives that test presuppositions dear to the history of aesthetics. In the next photo, it's I've got something that says moving towards the ugly, and there's an image from the documentation of a living intervention or performance that happened at U of T in Flesh of the World, which was curated by disability scholar Amanda Kachia. And the work is One Morning in May by Hayar Dewachi, and it was created by Nomi Lakshmir. And basically in this piece, Nomi sets out crawling along the ground from Tawny Studios in Tower Hamlets towards the city of London. And in this kind of what would normally be seen as an easy 1 mile stroll, Nomi has to do it on her hands and knees without her wheelchair. And she's smartly dressed in business attire and drags her body through the everyday streets of London. And their clothes get increasingly dirty and torn, and they're faced with cuts and bruises all over their leg by the time they get to London, really to underscore how the world without accommodation has been built without them in mind. And so there's a quote here that says, "We must shift from a politic of desirability and beauty to a politic of ugly and magnificence, and that we all run from the ugly. And the further we run from it, the more we stigmatize it, and the more power we give to beauty. So moving beyond a politic of desirability to loving the ugly, respecting the ugly for how it's shaped us and been exiled. It's by Mia Mingus. And I think ugly is used a bit facetiously in this instance, because I don't think what we're doing is necessarily moving towards ugly, but what we're doing is we're moving towards something scary, unfamiliar. So, maybe to some it seems ugly. But I think we are moving towards it, and nowhere is this more outrightly announced than in art, especially in sectors where accessibility is really becoming something important. It shouldn't. It's being recognized that it's not just an add-on to pieces. So in our act of shaping our realities through art, it's more necessary than ever to entwine ourselves with these concepts of access. Accessibility is concrete resistance and a rejection of those isolationist histories of disabled people, that disability isn't just located in our bodies, but it's located in society and how it's been built. So through its curatorial practicalities, we can begin to think about the alterities to movement and space itself. Disability, as I said, is in all our futures. And I don't say this as this impending threat of impairment to everyone, but rather as a way of considering all of our proximities to disability and our understandings of how the world is operated. As Mia Mingus says, ableism has to be included in our analysis of oppression because it cuts across all our other movements. Ableism dictates how bodies should function against a mythical norm, an able-bodied standard of white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, economic exploitation, moral and religious beliefs, age, and ability. And understanding these ways in which ableism has shaped our world might prompt us to reconsider the myths that one can transcend ableism simply by not being in proximity to disability. And I think that's where disability art comes in. So on the screen I have what is disability art. Underneath there are two questions: who can make disability art? What are the aesthetics of disability art? And to the right is an image of Alison Lapper pregnant, created by Mark Quinn. Alison Lapper is a disability activist in the UK, and this statue that was created was placed right in Trafalgar Square in the UK to sort of memorialize Lapper in this sort of form that is typically reserved for historic icons, if you will, like thinking of busts of generals and presidents. And I think in this, Alison has subverted that notion of who is represented in these spaces. But this piece was also quite controversial, and I'll get to that in a minute. But to start, I think we have to recognize that disability art, as we can see in this slide, is not art therapy. It's not outsider art. So when we think of disability art and its relationship to disability as art therapy, we're actually recalling these legacies of institutionalization and the entrenched ableism, which kind of recalls the ways that disabled folks have been excluded from participating in society. Art therapy is created, and I think art therapy is really great as a form of therapy, but I think the default in which disabled folks creating art therapy is really problematic in how it takes away the agency of the artwork being created. It takes away a political aspect of how work is created. And outsider art also has an incredibly ableist legacy in that outsider artists were oftentimes artists working in institutions, and curators would come in to a space, see the art that was created, and basically steal this art. They would take it, they would present it in gallery spaces, and they would sell it without giving any of the profits back to the artist. The artist wouldn't be invited to their own openings, and oftentimes it was actually encouraged to exclude the artist from participating in order to create and maintain this mystique of the disabled artist sort of working in isolation. And so, I really want to enforce that disability arts is not art therapy or outsider art, especially because oftentimes art therapy, until a curator discovers it, it wasn't seen as being art in itself. So, in the next slide, everything's remained the same, except underneath, it sort of answers the last two questions. It says, disability art has been coined the last avant-garde by Yinka Shonibare. And I think this is a really great way to think about disability art, because art imagines possibilities and futurities by exercising these new perceptions of the world. Disability art's distinct power is to reshape our modalities of art making and exhibiting, and they're tools to dismantle ableism's pervasive hold on our society. So as Yinka Shonibare has smartly discerned, disability arts is the last avant-garde arts movement remaining. So he parallels its emergence to feminist art, to black arts, to queer arts that emerged in the 1960s, and recognizes that disability art and the accessible curatorial practices that come with it are really the last remaining pillar to how we don't kind of understand these ways of art making. And this is a pivotal shift, I think, in our understanding of the relationship between art and disability. So art, I think has, as I said, in the mainstream been thought of only as a good for disability. So for its therapeutic good. Or, there's been art that's been leveraged by disability theorists as a methodology for world making and for world dismantling. But I think it's important that today we mark disability as a good for art. So, art isn't just good for disability. Disability isn't just good for art. Disability is good for art. And in this way, when we think of disability arts as the last avant-garde, then we stratify disability arts within the canon and outside of it at the same time. And it becomes this force that's propelling our art sector to these new and exciting heights in other ways that the art world, I think, has sort of stagnated. And when I say disability arts, I think I have to recognize that I'm using that as an umbrella term for art created by mad, deaf, disabled, crip, spoony, sick folks, all within that umbrella. And that disability arts in itself has a lot of different streams and different practices. Disability arts I use sort of as this umbrella term which contextualizes the larger community. But there is art, within deaf culture. There's Devia arts, which represents, the deaf visual and image arts. And there's different ways in which the community has represented its own movement. But for all intents and purposes for this talk, I'll be using disability arts as an umbrella term for it. So in this next image, in this next slide, it says art is access to life. And underneath, it's an image of constructed identities by Persimmon Blackbridge, which was Tangled Art Gallery's inaugural exhibition. And so, I've mentioned how the art world has always been interested in, the broken body or the disabled body and recognized it as beauty. But I think it's important to start underscoring that disability art adds this political understanding that shifts our perceptions of who holds the keys to our body's narratives. If, as Walter Benjamin would suggest, life and the affairs of living are conceived of as innately artistic, then our hyper-visible lived experience, an experience of navigating a world that's been built to exclude us, is the most politically and artistically powerful creative yield imaginable. And in this way, accessibility and the creative frictions of world building can be marked as these distinct aesthetics of disability arts. Here, I think it's important to give some context into the art sector as well, because disability arts participates in a way that I think naturally falls in line with the trajectory of the arts sector in Canada. In Canada, there's an entire artist-run culture of nonprofits and charitable art spaces run for and by artists that support new and innovative practices. And it has a really rich history of kind of railing against the institution. And so These centers exhibit contemporary art that parallels like larger institutions and the private commercial galleries, but it offers an alternative to artists for how they determine their artwork is represented. This is something that emerged in the 1970s, around the same time that disability rights was really beginning to take hold in response to some of the queer movements, to the civil rights movements that were already well underway. And so I think that, in Canada especially, because art is publicly funded, it's something that, in Canada, the government has said this is a vital aspect to how it is that people can participate fully in our culture. So if artwork is inaccessible, if culture doesn't reflect, who we are, then we don't have access to this really vital aspect to our community. We don't have access to our community. And so that's why I think art really is access to life in these ways. In this next slide, it's Progress is a Spiral Upward, which is another exhibition that was at Tangled. To the left is sort of this this collage of works that form sort of a cross shape, and to the right is a single one of those images expanded up. It's called A Fever Swelled in Me by Sav Maynard. And it features this white and black figure of visual elements behind this dark brown metallic background. And these elements kind of flow upward into this, upwards from this door or potential portal underneath, and goes into these really bright colored borders and full of greens and reds and gold rope. And this kind of this image is this flurry of movements which represent seasons, changing time, and growth. And I think this is a really great image for thinking about how we position disability arts as this spiral upwards. So just because of this overwhelming adherence that society has had to the medical model of disability, and the medical model would sort of isolate disability solely to the body, whereas social models of disability would think about how society's been constructed in relationship to disability. Political models would think about how it is we embody these CRIP identities, and then relational models would think about disability in relation to one another and in relation to larger communities as a whole. So this overwhelming kind of adherence to the medical model of disability in mainstream society means that to imagine disability as having any sort of place there is still radical. But I think what we're doing is in parallel to queerness, which has faced unprecedented levels of mainstream acceptance in the last 10 years, I think disability is pushing forward into our futures. And what I'm doing is I'm borrowing from Jose Esteban Munoz's concept of this queer horizon, which is this utopic rejection of heteronormativity, and I'd encourage us to think of a CRIP horizon, which is the title of my presentation. So the CRIP horizon would sort of drive this political potential of disability arts forward. And it parallels this queer horizon that Munoz is proposing. Because of the fierce assertion of the possibility of outside or more than one, CRIP and queer really share these striking ranges of political and imaginative affinities. So holding the intersections of access and disability, the CRIP horizon, I think, gestures towards these ever-moving possibilities and futures for disability, away from the ugly, towards this magnificence in our imperfections, and towards this aesthetic uniquely situated and held in disability art. And I've been using the word CRIP a lot, and I think it's important to explain that word, actually. CRIP is a reclamation of a derogatory word that's been used to refer to disabled folks. And what Kelly Fritsch, a disabled disability scholar, has done is taken that word, CRIP, and turned it into a verb. And that verb is to open with desire for the way that disability can disrupt. And so to crip is to sort of disrupt these spaces, but with this desire for it. And so crip aesthetics would imply the aesthetics of our own political desires for disability. So in this image here, I've got the Bodies in Translations guiding principles, and I think this is important because Bodies in Translation, they're a SSHRC grant headed by Eliza Chandler and Carla Rice, and they're really thinking about how it is that we can lead with difference. That's one of the guiding principles. Another one is manifesting access. Another is enacting radical reciprocity, and another is working in decolonizing and intersectional ways. And to the right is this image of the Bodies in Translations principles and governance of governance and engagement. And it sort of creates this beautiful through line of the different activisms involved in disability. So I highly recommend that folks take a look at the Bodies in Translation website and kind of experience what that is. But I want to break down some of these guiding principles because I think they really work towards thinking about dismantling ableism in our society. So leading with difference is one that I try to recognize in all of the things that we do at Tangled. So encouraging working with others who have lived experience and paying them as you would a professional or any other consultant. Leading with difference means thinking about how our neoliberal framework of society is and trying to work against these privileges of how people are seen as resources, but rather in a sustainable and long-term way. I think manifesting access, that comes from Carmen Papalia's manifesto, Open Access, in which Carmen offers an approach to guiding how we participate and practice access and inclusion. So Papalia is inviting us to move beyond conventional notions of access, such as the checklist model, and instead to consider the ways that disability enables us to redefine how we understand care and community. In enacting radical reciprocity, that's a key to collaboration and making and sustaining relationships, and then working in decolonizing and intersectional ways is to bridge that gap from disability rights, which has previously been so siloed, to using disability justice as a framework, which centers BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer and trans folks within that larger framework of how disability can be thought of. So a crip aesthetic, what is a crip aesthetic? And the work I have here is by Leila Huack, and it's an installation during our Fault Lines exhibition at Contact Photography Festival. So I'm just going to describe the image inside, which is this kind of landscape photo. To the left side of the picture, there's this square field in which a portion of the picture is an old press photo from the 1960s depicting a photographer whose face is obscured by his camera, and he's taking a picture of Elizabeth Taylor. On the right hand is this sort of large, almost pig-like dome, and it's kind of spliced with these different interesting sort of artifacts that jut out and kind of create the formation of almost a snout to the right of it. And in kind of this small red writing is an arrow pointing upward that says clone. And this is one aspect of crip aesthetics that I want to highlight. It's one that I think I've observed most sort of apparently, and that's the aspect of glitch. And glitch is one of those aesthetics of disability that I think is inherently working in line together as an aesthetic and as a purpose. So typically glitch art would be seen as these spurious kind of technical ruptures. And so I think, to glitch is to disability as the web is to a living kind of organism. But Leila Huack here in our photography festival played on who can glitch and what can glitch, right? So if we consider disability as that unruly and powerful check on those normative logics and eugenic fantasies, then HUAC's techniques as a photographer and a collager embody her mad identity. Seduced by that kind of instant gratification of digital photography, what HUAC does is she attempts to kind of pull a bunch of things together and ultimately fails to conceal all the imperfections. And this piece here is called Clone. And there's this really kind of funny story is Leela sent me this print before it went into production. She said, "What do you think of it?" I said, "Oh, this is really interesting. But to the left, there's this red line and it says clone. So are you going to do that?" And she said, "Oh, like, I thought that was just part of the aesthetic and someone was contributing." So what had happened was someone that she sent the photo to had suggested she take this part of the background and clone it upwards to create sort of a more cohesive photo. And she thought instead that he was suggesting this as an aesthetic, to think of how this might be a clone. And I thought that was this really interesting way in which Leela's not working with glitch, but she is the glitch. And her relation to disability kind of highlights that way, that glitch art has always been something in the canon of art, but I think that it also still to today is using this concept of a disability aesthetic. Moving on to the next photo, and I recognize I'm kind of running out of time here, is a photo of Mad Room by Gloria Swain, and it's this long landscape photo of the installation. And I have been enforcing that disability art is not art therapy, and so had Eliza Chandler, who is our curator, our artistic director at the time. And so I remember this conversation that Eliza had when Gloria said, "My work is therapy." And we were like, "No, it's not. Like, it's definitely not therapy." But then Gloria underscored that her madness was political because as an aging Black woman, she experienced mental illness at the same skewed rates that other Black folks do, due to systemic racism, due to intergenerational violence and state-sanctioned violence against Black folks. Gloria's madness wasn't necessarily produced as mental illness in the same typical way that we would think of as misfiring synapses, but Gloria's madness was political, and so her art, which was therapy, was also political. And this is one of those ways that I think disability arts is great, is that we're always thinking about these ways that disability kind of conflicts with each other. And that's part of the histories of how disability, because it was constructed as something only in ourselves, when we're enacting community together, we're going to come up to these frictions. And I think that friction is that horizon that we're striving towards, that because so many folks come from a large intersections of different identities, we'll never hit a single way of thinking about what is disability art. And that brings me to my next image over here, Vanessa Dion Fletcher's Own Your Cervix, which there's a photo of these walls painted a menstrual blood red, and there's this Victorian furniture, and what Vanessa's done is amplified this Victorian furniture with her own menstrual blood and embellished it with these porcupine quills. And this is kind of this important, significant part of her Lenape heritage, is to literally puncture and disrupt the comfort that white settlers might experience in these Victorian pieces of furniture. And Own Your Cervix was about how colonization has taken a hold of how we view our bodies. So Vanessa in this time actually invited folks to come do these one-on-one cervical self-examinations as a way to decolonize our understanding of our own bodies. Entangled at that time was enacting new practices for access. And because of that, it really helped folks to understand that this wasn't this kind of second wave feminist throwback, but that it really was about disability and the body and who has claim to our bodies. And this was thanks to the access practices of Tangled. And Vanessa told us, in other spaces it was often misread, but here, thanks to access, thanks to the ways that we have thought about how people can help understand our works, that's been made clear. And I thought that was a really wonderful way in which we can think about access. The next exhibition I've got here is from our Flourishing series called Somehow We Stay Attuned. And Flourishing was created as a series in response to medical assistance in dying and how it is we think of our bodies and who gets to create the stories of our bodies. And so here we have these 3 multisensory wood boxes created by Salima Punjani. And on the front of the box is this backlit portrait of this like MRI. But what she's done is within each portrait overlaid it with this idealized photo of the person whose brain is being MRI'd. And she's created these stories that go with them to help folks connect with each other. And that's what this work is really about, is this idea of connecting. And so Salima wanted to experiment and stretch that idea. And what she's done is she's taken these light boxes and she's integrated and worked with Vibra Fusion Lab in London, Ontario, to really think about how it is we can transcend touch. Salima, as someone with MS, thinks about the degenerative aspects of MS and how she needs to think about communication and connection early on in life. And so what she's done is she's really made a multi-sensory box. In these boxes, there are stories that go with the portraits, and then these stories vibrate to the way that the stories have been told. You can put a headband on, and actually in the last box over here, which is Salima's own story, you could actually feel your reactions, your brain waves as they react to her stories being told. And if you don't want to listen, you just want to touch the box, that's also fine. On the back, she's engraved the same photo into these light boxes as a touchable component. And so Salima really was thinking about how she can embody many ways of connecting in this one sensorial work. And I think that's a really important way to think about disability arts is as connecting, right? When I showed that photo of Persimmon Blackbridge's constructed identities, there's this really great story that Eliza tells when we were first opening Tangled, was that we wanted a piece that was touchable. And we worked with Persimmon to curate this whole exhibition, and we asked Persimmon, like, can these works be touched? And she said, no, like, they're really delicate, fragile pieces. They're made of found objects. They're made of these gentle Barbie dolls. And so we said, okay, like, how can we make this multisensorial? How can we kind of break down the visual, privileging only the visual ways that people experience visual arts? So we thought maybe we'll 3D print something and you can touch that, or maybe we can have some of those, the materials that you use to create the wood sculptures be touchable. And Persimmon said, actually, we've got a lot of time. Why don't I go back and create a new piece for touch? But not just that it can be touch. Persimmon wanted to think about the experience of touch and how that can enact the same response as seeing a piece. So she created the piece not to be touched, not to be seen, but rather to be touched. She thought about the symmetry of the piece, the structure of it, the different interesting components that you could touch. And I think that is the beauty of that disruption of disability, is that in this case, what Eliza and Persimmon found together was new art and new possibilities in these accessible curatorial practices that we're trying to create at Tangled. So not only that, we hang all of our works at a lower level so that folks of shorter stature can see the works. We have all our public-facing texts created in translated into ASL. We make sure all of our events are free because that's a really important aspect of how people can participate in culture. A lot of disabled folks are on the poverty line, so we have to make sure our experiences that we create, if we want to include these audiences, are free. We always have ASL at all of our public events. We have captioning. We have care attendance. But we also creatively work with these artists in thinking about their works. And I think that story that I just told has a lot to do with access intimacy. So in this next photo, we've got this photo of Aslan Thomas, who's an artist we exhibited in 2018. And underneath it says that we have to remember that access isn't limited to audience participation. It's equally vital to the integrity of our artistic landscape to represent the folks we want coming to our events to be reflected in the works that they consume. So to do that, we have to center access at the core of what we do and how we work with others and in the creation of works. So I think it's really important and something to highlight after all is said and done is that disability art privileges a different way of thinking. When we open up with desire for disability differently, we open up desire for how disabled folks can work. And access intimacy is this elusive, hard to describe feeling that Mia Mingus coined, but has always been around for disabled community. And it's just sort of how people get you and get your access needs. The kind of comfort that comes up when your disabled self can be yourself with someone on a purely access level. And I think that's what we try to embody at Tangled, is working with artists. We try to create access intimacy so that artists don't have to recall the legacies of ableism when they're working with us. And we're trying to make this not just an aspect of our art making practices, but because of our space, we're trying to enforce this in other new spaces too. There's a final work over here that I want to showcase. It's called 3 Windows, and I'm not sure that it'll work, but let's see if it does. It's working, actually. So I'll just pause this piece. And I'm going to play another piece that I hope is going to work. Let's see. Okay, those were the 2 pieces. And I kind of did that facetiously because what Aslan does is create these invitations to slowness. And here in this piece, Aslan, as part of an exhibition called Art Spin, created this piece to invite folks to think about these how we can be slower in our lives. These are like these really simple locked off shots, portrait style, of windows inside Aslan's apartment. And in each case, the window's open but covered with a curtain, and it just kind of barely moves in the breeze when it's installed. But as someone with a number of chronic health problems in the mix, Aslan spends a lot of time at home and time in the bed, and she wanted to think about this idea of being productive in a non-traditional sense. And so Aslan was actually challenging audiences to think about where it is that we're coming from when we're approaching disability arts. In this piece, we were in a part of this exhibition called Holding Patterns by that Art Spin put on. And it was held at this storage room facility. So there were lots of little storage lockers, and each locker was activated as as kind of your own gallery space. So Aslan created a single canvas, projected onto it, and had these windows play. And I was speaking to Aslan, and I said, you know, we always try to think about how access can be part of this this work. And so she said, okay, yeah, like I want to think about audio describing it. But then she thought, that's sort of not the intention of this piece, this slowness. And so Aslan went back and actually commissioned disabled artists to create these long narratives, long audio descriptions, if you will, of these pieces. And what I played was just kind of the first 10 seconds, and because it was an invitation to slowness, didn't even start yet. But what she did was Aslan actually created the audio description of this work in her title. So the full title of this piece is Three Windows Described by Three Voices. Anna Bowen describes the first, a window with cream-colored curtains of varied lengths, hanging from a sagging rod, occasionally blowing in the breeze. Catherine Frazee describes the second, a window covered by dense gray curtains that respond to a gentle wind, the light peeking around the edges, alternately growing and diminishing. Laura Burke describes the third, a window with off-white curtains that are at times still and at others billowing out or sucked back against the window screen, either fully or partially, the play and glow of light animating the space. So that's just the title. Then she took the piece, which is, as I've just described, three different windows, and she asked these other disabled activists and artists to create poetic descriptions that matched the length. So there are these long, beautiful poems done in crypt voices, and they're actually cycled instead of overlaid. So what happens is when someone comes into this locker, they will either see a window billowing, or they'll hear this poetic description of the visual arts. And Aslan is sort of weighing that these two are equal ways in which we can experience visual arts together. And it was just this really interesting experiment, because we got a lot of people coming to us saying, your piece isn't working anymore, we have to fix it. And I would say, like, actually that's the point of this piece. That is the crypt aesthetic of this piece. And so I think these are those ways in which art can really allow us to think about the possibilities of the future. And that's why I think disability is in all of our futures. And I'm going to wrap this up because I have kind of gone over a little bit. Thank you. I guess we have time for questions. Do we have time for questions?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, we do have time for questions. Just for Q&A, I'll ask if you'd like to speak. Put your hand up, let me know, and I'll make sure that you've got a microphone, and that'll be captured on our camera as well.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned a lot today, as I always do at these sessions, so thank you, UTSC. The first thing that I learned today is that crip can be a verb. and thank you for defining the term, because until you did that, I thought, I can't use that word. Maybe he can, but I can't. But there was one sentence in your presentation where you used a bunch of other, what I might call nicknames.
Yeah.
Like, for example, spoonies.
Yeah.
Can you define some of those terms, and can you tell me where I can find more information about that kind of terminology?
Definitely. So one of the big ones, actually, I can talk a bit about different disability cultures. For example, deaf. When I use the word deaf, I use it with a capital D to refer to deaf folks as culturally deaf. That is, as deaf folks don't identify as being disabled. They identify as being part of a linguistic minority in which ASL, American Sign Language, is their first language. And that's also another reason why we always have all of our public materials translated into ASL, is because they're not the same thing. Some folks might have literacy only in ASL and not in written English. MAD is another term I used, and that's a reclamation similar to CRIP of, I know a lot of folks who have experienced different mental illnesses, have experienced in connection with the psychiatric system, or have experiences of mental health issues, or have identified with those in some way. And MAD is sort of this umbrella term that is that embodies the political aspects of disability. So the same way in which we're talking about not just identifying as someone with a physical disability, but as identifying politically with your disability. MAD is another way of identifying with mental illness in this more political way of being. Spoonie is another word which is talking about chronically, it references folks who have chronic illness or have different levels of energy. And so if you'll imagine your energy as being spoons, as being measured in a number of spoons, perhaps going to school takes up 3 spoons, and so you might have a certain number of spoons left in the day to participate in, doing your homework, eating dinner, hanging out with friends. Those are all ways in which spooning folks would use different spoons throughout the day to represent how much energy they have left. I think those were some of those terms that I used, and it's similar to the way in which I talked about there's never one singular movement that embodies all of the disability community, right? There's folks who have said, I don't like the word MAD, or I don't like the word CRIP, the same way that a lot of LGBTQ plus folks might not like the word queer because of some of those histories that it might recall. So we always have to be sensitive to how it is that we talk about these things. But I think because in this presentation, for example, I'm really thinking about disability as a political embodiment in addition to what it is we're talking about in terms of a societal or medical way of thinking about disability, then I'm using these terms kind of in an umbrella way. Thanks. Yeah.
Does your gallery have an actual location, and can you tell us where it is?
It does, and you should come.
Okay.
So I'm actually really happy to say that Tangled is the first, I believe it's unfortunately the only, disability art gallery in Canada. So we have an art space. It's a free art space the way that most other artist-run centers are free at the 401 Richmond building. That's 401 Richmond Street West. And the 401 Richmond building actually is this really legendary hub of different artist-run centers. Some of the oldest artist-run centers, like A Space Gallery or like YYZ, are there. And I think what's really amazing is that folks come from all over the world to the 401 Richmond building, and they stumble onto our gallery space. And it is great that disability arts is a contender, I think we simultaneously have to think about what the system is we're participating in, but we also want to create the opportunities for those who do want to participate to be involved. We also do a number of partnerships. We just opened up an exhibition called Access is Love and Love is Complicated at the Critical Distance Center for Curators. That's at Artscape Young Place, 180 Shaw Street. And Access is Love and Love is Complicated, just as a quick plug. I curated with Emily Cook, and it is thinking about the frictions of disability. That's when we enact CRIP community together, then those are some of the good frictions that we're experiencing in building community together. One piece that you can experience at this exhibition is by an artist named Andy Slater, who's a blind artist, and he creates sound pieces. So they're sound works. There are oftentimes he does different experiments with them, tapping his cane in different spaces, really activating it through the echoes and the soundscapes that are created. And so Andy wanted to create a piece that was more accessible. So he created this book that went with a book of audio descriptions that went with these sound pieces. And he really spent a lot of time on this book, commissioning folks to help him create the cover, to design it, to really make it a beautiful book of poetic image descriptions that go with these sound pieces. So much so that the piece became totally integrated into the works. That's part of the aesthetic of access that I was talking about. But because of that, he found that he had made the piece inaccessible to his own audience. Suddenly the blind community couldn't really experience the full depth of his work. And so then he had to think about, okay, I'll translate this now into Braille. And then he had that created in this book of plain language audio descriptions that you could then listen to. And then he was thinking like, well, where do I stop from here? Because you can keep going in this cycle of access in thinking about, how it is we can integrate these aesthetics and include others. So that's one of those complicated ways that I think we're thinking about access. Another work is a new series by Vanessa Dion Fletcher, and I think it's important to highlight, for example, how within a colonial lexicon, a colonial world, an indigenous lexicon, disability isn't necessarily a thing. I've learned from elders like Mona Stonefish that in her community, even though I might consider Mona disabled, she has her place. She's a storyteller, she's an elder, she's really had a place. And so when we're inviting and we're centering disability justice in our frameworks, then we have to consider how we do it. I can say, as someone who works in a disability art gallery, as someone who is going to be visibly disabled anyways, and as someone who was born in Toronto, I can say I am a proud disabled person. And I can do that without too much consequence. Whereas other folks whose status here might be challenging, for folks with whom they haven't disclosed because of their workplace, then embodying this political identity can be a challenge, right? So those are some of those ways that disability has a lot of friction when we're generating community in kind of these really political ways. Another artist who's involved there is Adam Wolfrand and Estee Clark. And Adam is a non-speaking autistic artist. And I think one of the things about the disability community is that we haven't had the right opportunity to think about how we allow folks with different learning disabilities or folks who have different kinds of ways of communicating to really integrate, because so much of disability art is about agency, so that when someone is working with another in this kind of interdependent, leading way, then we say, whose authorship has really been the voice in this piece? And so Adam and Estee are a mom and son duo, and we wanted to challenge our own discomforts with thinking about how someone's work is presented and how we can embody different models for working together. Tangled is actually the only arts organization in Canada where all of our staff are identified from the disability community, either being from MAD, deaf, disability spaces. And now that we want to think about challenging ourselves and how it is these models of leadership might be able to be different in the future, or how we can include others in the future whose voices may have been elided even in this structure.
Sean, if I may, since I happen to be holding the microphone.
Yeah.
I was really interested in the concluding remarks that you made about the Three Windows piece and the story about, this piece of art is broken.
Right.
We need to fix it.
Right.
We need to fix it. And I thought that was such an interesting moment of how the world of art might converge with a kind of a medical model around disability.
Mm-hmm.
The art is broken through the medical model of disability. a body is broken.
Right.
And I thought that was a really reflexive moment of how while often we separate, art has very different objectives and assumptions than medicine does, a very kind of weird, I think, critically interesting convergence of those very domains that for me was a real summarizing point in your wonderful presentation.
Well, I think like that touches on this idea of being allowed to fail. And I think it also has to do with like professional development, right? When I think about artists, just in general, when I was growing up, professional development was so important for artists to be able to go to residencies, to be able to get grants, to create works, and to fail when that happens. And disability is not given that same, I think, breadth, you know? I think, unfortunately, a lot of times there's this unspoken assumption that once a disability art piece has been created, that's the artist's practice. And there's no growing or there's no experimenting or no expanding from there. But that's not true. Disabled artists need professional development opportunities. They need to be able to fail as well. And to be able to experiment and say that something didn't work without representing the entire disability community in that one failure. And I think that's really important, is that everyone is sort of, everyone has this inclination that disability and failure are related. And I instead want to think about failure as an aesthetic, as part of that work. And we did have artists who have experimented, and they've said, for example, we had an artist named Bishara Elmi who came and created these works out of dirt sculptures. And it related to their experience as an immigrant, as someone from which home is not necessarily always going to be present. And so Bishara created dishware out of dirt, and that dirt crumbles away. And what they did was not intend for it to fail, but they opened for the possibility of failure. That throughout this time, perhaps some of the works would crumble, perhaps some of the works, when it's touched, would break. And that was part of kind of the natural experience of life in general. And so, some of the works did crack. and we were like, no, that's okay. That's on purpose. And everyone would take a moment to think like, okay, this, and I hope that the connection was not, okay, this disability art gallery is failing. I hope that it is intentional, right? It's experimental and it's provocative in thinking about how it is that we work in our own lives and how we think about our perceptions of what disability can bring to the table rather than what it is as a deficit.
What a conclusion, if I may. Please join me in thanking Sean Lee for his wonderful talk. Just a few notes I've been asked to provide you before we wrap up. Sean is very generously offering, if you'd like some one-on-one discussion, that you're welcome to speak with him following the talk. Also, please feel free to drain the refreshments that are at the back of the room. And complimentary parking passes are available at the registration desk if you haven't yet picked them up. The feedback form, as I requested, please remind us that we exist. We're at a university. We need feedback. And if there are themes that you would like to see in future Great Exploration talks, let us know, because we really want these to be responsive to what a terrific audience you've been. So thank you. No seminar next Monday, or next week, pardon me, but the following, on the 22nd of October, will be Anne McGuire on the subject of tracking autism, wearable tech, and the digitization of disabled childhoods. And we have the full series listing available just outside. And I see also my colleague Cassandra Hartley, who will be presenting in the final week of October on her wonderful work and research here in disability studies. So thank you to Sean Lee. Thank you to the Dean's Office for coordinating the speaker series. And please take your time. We've got the room until noon.
Can I make one last plus? While Cass and Anne are here, I also just want to say that Tangled will be working with Cassandra in programming an exhibition in the future in 2021 called hashtag Crypt Rituals, embodying the digital aspects of Crypt community. And we're so grateful to be working with the Doris McCarthy Gallery together with Anne over here just in presenting this. Yeah.